Hello, everyone. This is a meeting of the Right to Know Advisory Committee's Technology Subcommittee.
It's still starting up. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, okay.
We're there.
We're live now, yes?
You're
okay.
Good.
Welcome to the Right to Know Advisory Committee Technology Subcommittee meeting. This is our second meeting of this group. And if we just, excuse me, I'm recovering from pneumonia, so you're gonna just have to all be very patient with me. And I may have to hand off to someone else if I get into a fit here. If we could just go around the room and introduce ourselves. I'm Judy Meyer. I'm the editor of the Sun Journal and the Kennebec Journal and the Morning Sentinel, and a long-time member of the Right to Know Advisory Committee meeting. Linda?
Hi, I'm Linda Clancy. I'm representing the press. I'm in Camden and editorial director of the Penn Bay Pilot.
Thank you. Kevin?
Hi there, Kevin Martin. I'm FOA coordinator for the Maine DEP, usually representing government interests on the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jim?
I'm Jim Campbell, and I've been on the committee for a few years, and I represent a statewide group committed to access to public information.
Thank you. Chris?
I'm Chris Parr. I represent law enforcement interests on the committee. And Judy, I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you. Amy?
Hi, I'm Amy Beveridge. I'm the news director at WMTW. I've been on the Right to Know Advisory Committee now for 3 years, 4 years, maybe. I don't know.
Time flies.
And I'm representing the Maine Association of Broadcasters.
Thank you. And Eric?
Eric Stout, the member with background in information technology. This is my 6th year serving the committee.
Thank you. And Brenda Kilty has joined us, the Maine State Ombudsman. And of course, Anna, Peggy, and Rachel, staff that we could not do without. So thank you. So let's work through our minutes from last meeting. Eric, you had some suggestions on edits that we'd received just before this meeting. Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, just a little clarification. I meant to look at that earlier, but I just looked at that before the meeting and sent that to staff and subcommittee members. It was when we were talking about the state archives policy. And of course, Kate McBrien, the state archivist, joined us about that point. So I didn't want to violate protocol if she had any clarifications, but I did see the need to clarify the difference between the state policy, which was initially issued in October of 2013. And then there's the annual reminder about acknowledging the policy. It's a 2-page policy versus the record schedules, which are a voluminous number of schedules. There's about 17 or so state general schedules, and there's 19 or so local government schedules. And then every state agency has its own agency specific schedule. So I just wanted to clarify that we were talking about the policy and the schedules, and those are really 2 separate groups of things, but they're of course all interrelated. So I think that my suggested edits would clarify that. And again, I would defer to the state archivist if she wants to clarify further. But since those were tagged as my comments, I felt I needed to, clarify them.
Anybody have any objections if we just clarify our notes from last meeting on Eric's suggestions? All right, Peggy, do we need to, or Anna, do we need to approve these summary notes or not?
Not by, as far as I know. Peggy, you don't do it in any of the others, do you?
Kind of keep track of them informally, so
Okay.
you can always go back and look, but there's nothing formal about them.
All
Thanks,
right.
Peggy.
Thank you, Eric, for going through all of that. I appreciate it. Okay, so our task last meeting was to look at some of the retention policies for some of the organizations, Maine School Management, Maine Municipal Association, the counties, and the legislature. And we had those organizations sent us back examples of their policies and procedures. And I am so impressed with Maine School Management's organization and how they worked with the archives to reorganize the retention schedules. It was exhaustive. So there's probably a model in here somewhere. But I know Vicki Wallach was really keen on making sure that we understood that they take this very seriously, and they do really work with superintendents to make sure retention schedules and training is right up to the minute. And based on the paperwork, that seems really clear. On the other hand, it looks like MMA pushes their members to the state archives to look at the schedules, but doesn't have policies per se. So each town kind of has their own file management practice. And the same thing, I think, here goes for the counties as well, that they push their members to the schedules so that they can read about the retention policies, but there's no blanket policy. And then the legislature doesn't really have a policy either. It's a practice, right?
I've got some information for you for
Okay.
that whenever you're ready.
Yes,
Are you ready?
please.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So we did do some follow-up from that. I just didn't have anything to send you per se. So what we did learn is that the legislative policy uses the same, well, first of all, the definitions in the statute for state agencies used to exclude the legislature, but now it includes the legislature. So we do actually comply with the records management procedures that the state agencies use. We use the same correspondence schedule as agencies, the one that that Eric was talking about before with the, the distinctions between the types of correspondence. But in addition to that, the legislature doesn't actually have a retention policy, which in practice means that we're archiving indefinitely at the moment. So there is there are digital records of all the emails on the servers, whether we delete them or not. They're still there in the cloud or whatever it is those things actually are. The basic thing here is that we do what the state agencies do, except that because we don't have a retention policy that distinguishes between all types of correspondence, we're actually keeping them all, and we're keeping them all for longer than the state might be required to. So they're all there. It is more complicated for legislators with respect to personal devices, and since you are obviously getting a briefing from Brenda about how they talk to legislators about that. I do know that the Legislative Council strongly discourages, is the language I was told, legislators from doing text messages and personal devices for legislative businesses. And I'm sure that you have seen, if you get an email from a legislator, that privacy disclaimer on their emails, which I think Brenda can also tell you more about. But the bottom line is we do what the state agencies do. So what Eric told you all about is also what we do.
So it sounds like Maine is saving a whole lot more paperwork, well, digital and paperwork, than it needs to.
Well, it's because we don't have a way to distinguish, so we keep more than necessary. It's not the paper side of it, it's just the digital side of it.
Okay, so Maine School Management has policy and schedules. The legislature follows state agencies, but doesn't have schedules.
Well, we have schedules. It's not that we don't have schedules. It's just that in the practical sense, we're actually keeping them all. It's not that we don't have schedules. It's more just that if a record has to be kept for 2 years, that's all it has to be kept for. But out there in the ether, whatever that thing is, it's there forever at the moment.
Okay.
But we do follow the same schedules and the same, the same.
So there's not a lot there's no cleanup after the let's just say it's 60 days, 2 years, 5 years. Nobody's going back and just, okay.
Right.
Eric?
Yeah, I like to describe it as, speaking of electronic records, as all the little fishies swimming in one big ocean. So when we had, our records were mostly paper, and imagine the old days where you have a file cabinet and the top drawer is the current year, and the next drawer is the year before, and the third drawer is the year before that, and then the fourth drawer is 3 or 4 years old, and then that cycles out. But when you have electronic files, as Anna was describing, and that's just the case everywhere, is that, unless you have a lot of discipline up front to say these files or these emails are segregated by year, you might have guidance to do that, but in practice, people generally don't do that. So that's the challenge for both emails and any kind of electronic files, is that they're all kind of swimming in the same ocean unless there's a lot of discipline and foreplanning about segregating them by topic or by year, which generally I find is not the case.
So do we as a group have any interest in wading into that? Amy?
I actually had a question regarding the legislative policy. You mentioned that it is discouraged for people to use personal devices to do any text messages, but what about state issued devices, phones and whatnot?
Brenda may know more about that, but as I don't know the answer to that. I think it's the same kind of problem you have with the state that we talked about last time, but I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there's no answer to that at the state side. So, but Brenda will have more information about what we actually tell legislators. In terms of what we do, I don't have an answer to that.
Okay, so use of text messages is discouraged on personal devices, and any correspondence on personal devices is discouraged, but there's no discouragement on state issued devices, or you just don't, it just isn't stated.
Well, for the legislature, I'm not sure how many state issued devices there are. I know agencies, a lot of agency people, especially liaisons, have a phone that's issued by the state. I don't know that that is happening with any legislative staff or legislators themselves. I mean, that might be happening in like the leadership offices, but we certainly don't see that or hear of it. Am I wrong,
Yep.
Anna? I don't.
I don't know about partisan offices either.
Yeah. So I know it's still an issue at the state level. I don't know that it matters because I don't think there are state issued devices for legislators or legislative staff.
Thank you.
Linda?
Thank you. Like you, Judy, I was impressed with the Maine school management, but I was unimpressed with the municipalities. I was thinking, oh boy, well, where are they getting their information? I'm wondering if the different law firms are recommending certain practices, but it does lead to an uneven, rocky road, I think, for that, and the counties as well. So where do we go next? I'm like, man, this is perfect timing for coordinating something. And if it's this committee that recommends it, I'm all for it.
Is there an appetite to suggest that municipalities and the county organizations have sample policies on retention and management?
I would think that a kind of a basement level recommendation would be useful. In other words, a minimum that they could adjust above if they chose to. But it sounds to me, at least, looking at each has their own way of doing things, that there is no minimum. So, one county or one town might say, well, we don't keep that. And another county or town says, oh yeah, we keep it for a week. So that there's no way then to gain information about certain kinds of records throughout an area or throughout the state, if I'm understanding these responses correctly.
Linda?
I wonder if the basic training comes in with when each town does its FOIA training for the different committees, if it's established there, but then it's never really taken up again. But that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I don't think, and Brenda may be able to answer this question, I don't think the FAQ that we have developed over these many years has a lot of like policy structure in it. It has, what the law says, but not necessarily, and this is how you need to manage it. Brenda, could you talk to that a little bit, please?
Well, I'm happy to talk to it. I'm just not sure. I missed your last meeting, so I'm not really sure where this is coming from, because we're talking about records management, and I'm not sure how it evolved. I just want to be sure, excuse me, I just want to be sure to be focusing on what your question is.
So at our last meeting, we talked about kind of the various ways records are managed, and it's not the same in each place, county, town, school, legislature. So we asked these professional organizations to provide us with some feedback on how they recommend to their members the records management policies and practices. And Maine School Management has an exhaustive recommendation and really seems to be right on top of it. And MMA and the counties really just refer their members to the retention schedules at the Secretary of State's office.
Right.
So the
Okay.
question is, whether there should be more, that should be more formalized than just sending people to the website to interpret what the records retention schedules suggest, or.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I think I do have a couple of things to say about this. First of all, in every training that I do, I reference records management, because the access to public records is really meaningless if you can't find those records or they haven't been preserved. So it's really fundamental to the exercise of the Freedom of Access Act right to access records. So I always involve a component in my records in my trainings, but Archives has a records management division with excellent staff, and this is their expertise area. So they are there not only to create schedules, but to provide trainings and answer questions. And that's an enormous resource for every level of government. So I don't know, even if MMA is not putting out a policy, the actual core resources for records management sits in Archives. And I'm sure that Kate would have some more to say about this, but that's where the assistance would come from. And they provide trainings and walk agencies through creating schedules and updating schedules and all of these sorts of things. So I do think that I want to make sure we give Kate an opportunity to describe the resources that are available through Archives, because that is the primary resource. So I could add something to the FAQs, but I'd simply be referring people over to Archives, because that's really where the content area experts sit, and they are the ones who are trained in records management. They are the ones who have the legal authority to oversee the records management system in the state of Maine. And that's really where those questions should go. My focus always is, though, to make it clear that FOA depends on good records management. But I think that the expertise comes out of archives for that. Does that answer your question?
It does for me. Does anybody else want to follow up? And Linda?
It's about records management, but it's also records protocol or discipline, or how to conduct, that I'm wondering if some of the and I'm still on municipalities, but some of the smaller towns may need some more guidance in, or something set out.
Can I add to that? Thank you, Linda. I totally agree, because I think that there's a very practical aspect to records management that people need help with. And if you don't have a good system in place, and even if you have a good system in place and people are not consistently employing it, it still is going to leave you with the chaos of records that you've either lost or can't find, or it takes an exceptionally long time to find. And that burden should not rest on the requester, on the FOA requester, right? Because we should expect that there's some minimum level of organization there. So I completely agree with that. And for instance, I'm just thinking back of some municipal trainings I've done several with, like, the city of South Portland. And I know that in preparing those FOA trainings, it covered very practical aspects that we actually had their IT department collaborate with us on, so we could talk intelligently about what the practical systems are in place for dealing with email, what the practical systems are in place for setting up Zoom meetings, all of those kinds of things. So I think what we see is that FOA exists in a relatively sophisticated arena now, as particularly when we're talking electronic, in electronic meetings, but also in electronic records. And often the answers, not the answers necessarily, but let's just say best practices. I'm not a big fan of that phrase, but we're kind of talking about the practical aspects of it. Without collaboration with IT and really practical assistance, people can be overwhelmed. So I do think that, and this is why I love to do trainings with Eric on the state level, because we're trying to bring the practical aspects, the IT, how do you handle these records? And also there's a lot of collaboration with archives, OIT, and myself in many different arenas right now. I feel like I have meetings all the time, and I always see Kate and Eric there. But on the municipal level, it's entirely possible to do trainings that bring in whatever IT system is in place for that municipality, who's handling the records management aspect, and then fold FOA into it. But I agree, Linda, with your earlier statement that it can be a rocky road in the sense that everybody is not the same. Every municipality, what are there more than 400 of them? They do not all have the same resources. They may not have the same level of sophistication. They may not have the same IT, right? And that's going to change everything. But despite all those differences, the local schedules are created and supervised, and they live under the authority of archives, not just the state, but the local schedules too. So that, again, is another huge resource in terms of helping each of those distinct municipalities go through a process of evolving their records management. And the reality here is that in 2021, it's very difficult to be a small town with a lagging IT, even in Maine. The expectation is that things are going to be accessible, that they're going to be electronic, that we're going to be, you know, all of these things, and it's a bit of a rocky road. So I see Eric's got his hand up. I don't want to keep talking.
And then maybe
Brenda.
we could, yeah, if we could hear from Eric, and then Kate, maybe we could have you weigh in, and I have a couple of questions for you as well. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said to date. I just wanted to kind of remind us that a big part of our discussion last time was about the challenges around text messaging and, you know, phone-to-phone text messages, and how to capture those that are substantive, that are about, you know, government business versus transitory value. And both the, you know, the technical challenges, the training challenges, and the kind of the understanding of that is part of government's, you know, the public business. So we've been talking just now about records management generally, but wanted to not lose the fact that that was a key challenge that we were trying to better understand about, you know, the policies and practices and practicality about preserving and transferring text messages from the phone.
And just looking forward, not just text messages, but whatever comes hereafter. Yeah. Kate, do you want to weigh in on all of this? And I'd be curious to know if you have a sense of how many municipalities and how often are the counties actually tap the resources for your training division for help?
We actually get calls from municipalities and the counties pretty regularly, as well as from, you know, school districts, you know, with specific questions. As questions come up, they call our staff and we help them. We do have local government record retention schedules on our website that provide a lot of guidance. But then when you get into the specific questions and want to understand how to apply something, they call us and we try to talk them through it. We also offer training regularly, but not everyone takes us up on that. So I think that's part of the struggle, I think, is that everyone has very busy jobs, and records management just seems like this extra thing that no one really has time for, or there's no specific deadline for. So you just keep pushing it off, which is completely understandable. So one thing that I'm hoping that the archives can tackle over the next few years is how do we make all of our expectations around good records management as easy as possible for everyone, so that it's not an added burden, but it's something that's pretty simple to do. We have to simplify the process somehow. And I'm not sure what that answer is yet, but it's something I think we need to work on. One of the things we are doing right now is we are revising the state general schedules and addressing some specific electronic records questions that frequently come up, like email management or social media, that sort of thing. Once the state general schedules are done, our goal is to then tackle the local general schedules that very often reflect with and correspond well with the state schedules. So I think we'll be providing some updated information and looking for help from the municipalities and the counties for that. But we got to get through the state general schedules first, and then that'll be a next project.
So do you see a need for municipalities and counties to have policy-specific records management documents, or is the training division that better? Is that a better resource?
Personally, I think most municipalities would benefit from developing their own records retention schedules. We have the state general schedules, which provide a basic framework to work from, but municipalities can always go above and beyond. They can do more. And really what our general schedules apply to are just those records that deal with the state and the towns. When there's town-specific records, we really don't get into a lot of that because we're a state agency, we're at the state level. Mm-hmm. So if individual municipalities don't have their own specific retention schedules based on what they're creating, it wouldn't hurt them. it could be cumbersome and it needs to work well within the state general framework. But it's something that they could definitely consider. But I'm sure Eric and Brenda want to weigh in on that.
Okay. Eric, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, so Kate's been the state archivist for a year or so, but in 2013, the state archive, actually the Secretary of State, which is the parent department over the state archives, issued the 2-page policy on preservation of state government records. And then every October or early November since then, it's been sent out as a reminder to all state employees. So that's something that I don't see on the local side, but from my perspective, and I think Brenda would probably agree from a FOA perspective, that that was a very good thing to have that in your face every year, that you were required to review the policy, and then several links, including to, get a understanding of the training that's out there, and the general and agency specific schedules. How to archive your email was one of the links at the time. So that was good, that was in their face and sent out proactively every year. But on this, and the schedules had been there, for decades, since the 80s and 90s, and refreshed occasionally over time. But from my perspective, the issuing of that in October 2013, the policy, and then the annual reminder of that, was really kind of a watershed moment. It really came out of in reaction to the, Judy will remember this, the infamous CDC document shredding case, which led to a government oversight committee and led to the report that Brenda and Tammy Marks from the archives co-authored with 25 recommendations, I think, about improving records management. But that policy was issued, around that time in response to, needing to improve awareness. That the policies basically were always there, but it just really focused in on the 2-page policy and the reminder every year to make people aware, and the training that resulted from that. So that, you can have something on the books, but I think everybody agrees that you really need the awareness and the training to drive the behavior. But I don't see that on the local side, just the state side.
Okay, thank you. Brenda?
I'm going to defer to Kate on questions about policies for local government, because I really think that the authority for that sits in archives, and they would really be in the best position to determine whether some sort of statewide policy, aside from the legal requirements that are already there, and the schedules themselves. So I don't really have much to add to that, but I did want to say the other thing is that the municipalities curate a lot of records. I think that particularly the clerk manages very carefully according to very explicit requirements, like vital records, for instance, tax records. There's a lot of stuff there. So I do think that in thinking about what sorts of schedules or requirements for retention apply, I think that there's a lot, actually. And we might, if you wanted to go down that road, you probably would want to talk to the clerks as well and see the kinds of records that they're handling. And then I just want to make this third point. I have one message about texting. Just don't do it. It just don't do it. There's just no good reason to do it. And no matter how sophisticated your IT and your record schedules and your policies, texts are going to be a problem. They're just a problem. So I always recommend just don't do it. And make sure that everything, all communications, if there is a municipal or a county or a state server, that it's on the server. You don't want it to be on some third-party platform. Get it on the server, because it's the agency itself that's responsible for managing those records. So just coming back to, it seems like maybe this started with texting. I just wanted to get my statement out on texting.
Linda.
Brenda, when you say get it on the server, do you mean every volunteer who serves on a committee in a municipality or school board has, I know school boards do this now generally, but municipalities have a town email address?
Yes, absolutely. And these are the kinds of practical steps that I always share. For instance, if, and this is the case in many towns, they don't have town email addresses for their board members. They're so small, they can't afford to have an email address for everybody. So people are communicating on their personal email accounts. And if that has to be, it's not the best situation, but for some, that's the reality. I always recommend that they have at least one, .gov address that they copy everything to, that is on their server. So that at least if they have to use a personal account, everything's getting copied over. And if that policy is in place and people are consistently employing it, then you can have some confidence in the reliability of a production off the server, which is what the agency wants. The agency needs to manage those records. So yes, I always recommend that if they unfortunately have to use personal email.
Linda?
Sorry, my hand was still up.
Okay, so where does that leave us? Do we have a recommendation based on this discussion? The annual reminder is an interesting one, Eric. Just oh yeah, by the way, it's that time of year again. Remember to start doing these things. I just don't know if that's something that would be just a recommendation. Can't see that we would write that into statute.
Well, I defer to, the state archivist, what she thinks, but when it was first issued by Matt Dunlap, in collaboration, of course, with Dave Cheever and the state archives people at the time in 2013, it was always titled as a state of Maine policy on preservation of government records, but sent to just state government agencies. It didn't go any farther than that, and explicitly said this is for state agencies. But the value of it is important, is that it brings the awareness of the records retention and records management generally out of the dusty shelves of records management, and makes it people aware of it, and it mentions electronic records, and it just brings into focus what people should be aware of, which in my perspective is the biggest challenge of, even though we have these policies and schedules, what percent of the people are really in practice following them? Number one, aware of them. And this annual reminder made people aware, put it in their face, and that required them to acknowledge it, whether they did or not. State archives did track, who they have a database. Felicia Kennedy keeps the database of who actually acknowledges agency by agency. So that data is there. But then, the practice is in place. I do know from personal experience that some agencies have taken that, and within the commissioner's office, they've sent that out, and they've emphasized that more, so that they don't just rely on the reminder from the Secretary of State. They own that. And I remember one year as the records officer, I got up to 87% of the staff that had acknowledged. It started with 4% when it first came out, and I just hounded people and got it up to 87%. But who actually had signed in that particular year. But I think it takes the agencies to own it and to push it and not just say, oh, well, that's Secretary of State or State Archives. That's their job. As the agency records officer, I see that that's my job. And if the agency people are unaware or following poor practices, that's on me.
So I don't even know if Right to Know has the authority to direct MMA or Maine County Commissioners Association to do such a thing, but we could recommend such a thing and provide maybe the state sample 2-page letter and have them, adapt it for their organizations. Is that worth doing or suggesting to the greater committee?
I think so.
Linda?
And is it also worth, I know the schools are much different from municipalities legally as well, but maybe incorporating some of what is in that language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know to Brenda's point, South Portland and Stowe, Maine are two very different places. And if you send the same document to those two places, South Portland could probably manage it and Stowe is going to freak out. So I think we need to be mindful of what the capacity is for the smaller towns. Linda?
You're very generous to the smaller towns and I have less patience for them. I think that these towns, we have intelligent people in all of them. And I just do believe it is as Eric, as the state does, a annual reminder. I think there's a lot of value in that. And it is a discipline, but it's also, this is access and this is the public's business.
And perhaps that reminder could include a tease to the training division at archives, just in case particularly new public officials may not be aware of that resource. Chris?
Thank you. I just want to make sure I understand. So what would we be expecting their policies to say? And I guess as a follow-up to that, is this only with respect to schedules that exist and are maintained by Kate's shop? Or would we also be saying that, if you don't have records retention schedules for town-specific records, that those ought to be developed too? I just want to make sure I understand.
Well, that is the question. I mean, we could suggest they have micro schedules. Just don't know how far we want to reach on our recommendation.
Well, if I could just
sure.
follow up on that. So is it the case that if there isn't a schedule that exists, theoretically, these records should continue to be retained indefinitely until a schedule is created by the towns or counties or what have you? Is there a concern that that's not happening?
I don't have that concern, but of course, it's hard to know. I will say the retention schedules at the archives are exhaustive, and their definitions cover so much. It's hard to believe there could be a document that wouldn't fit into some existing category, but who knows? Kevin? Oh, Kevin, we're not able to hear you.
Sorry about that. So I guess I'd like to echo the same thing. I think the state schedules are very good on the local level and covering the majority of the documents. I don't see much value in micro schedules just because it's asking for more work for things that are likely going to be tackled with something else. I think the other point to bring up is, and this might vary based on municipalities versus the state level, but as you know, Ms. Brew mentioned, I think the state has these same problems. Is the more and more electronic things get, the more obsolete these schedules become, because you might set out a schedule for years for transitory versus permanent records, but the technology doesn't distinguish between the two, and everything eventually becomes retained. So I think as state, especially on the town level, they need these schedules as long as things are in paper, and the more things shift electronically, I think the more things just get retained regardless. And then the question becomes, how do you find them, or how do you provide some sort of help in terms of training these people about how they're being retained? Where do these records go? Because I think that's really the question, is when things are in paper, people can utilize these resources for the retention schedules, because that's a really good resource. If you need to find information about how long something is supposed to be retained, it's a direct link to a website, and the answer is right there in the schedules for you. But once things become electronic, it becomes a much more complicated question where everything continues to exist. And you know, we are the technology committee. I think sometimes that might be the questions we need to be analyzing, as opposed to shifting backwards towards schedules for paper records on the municipal level. Just my 2 cents.
Kate?
So a couple of things on that. In theory, the way records management works is that is the format of the information doesn't matter, whether it's paper or electronic. The schedules are supposed to apply to that same information. So if you created it on paper and it was only supposed to live for 5 years, even if it's now created electronically, it should still only live for 5 years. The problem is, when it was paper, it was a physical thing that you would store, you would see, you would remember. With electronic, it's really easy to forget. One of the things that I've requested funding for in our supplemental budget is a digital preservation system, which would help with some of this record management. It would at least capture the archival digital records, which we really have no way to capture right now. And I could see that at some point. Right now, it would only capture for state government. At some point, it may need to grow to help municipalities as well, or help provide them with guidance as well. But I think if we can figure it out at the state level, we can kind of test out some different methods, which then municipalities might be able to use. But we have to kind of help figure it out for them first. That helps at all.
Kevin?
I can't speak for the municipalities, but I think that's the right approach. I think we should be taking is forward looking like that, and seeing in what ways that we could develop things on the state level that could then be passed on to the town level. Nobody needs to agree with me if they disagree on this, but I think a lot of these, we're looking at things that are going to resolve themselves. If we're asking them to put micro schedules together, that might be useful as long as they're in paper and they can follow them. But at some point, I think we're going to be shifting anyway. I'm not sure that's the best resources to be, putting already stretched municipalities under.
Okay, so where we've landed is that municipalities and counties, well, and school management, of course, is already doing this, but follows the state's lead. But that an annual reminder to these various entities is helpful to keep people on task and remind them of the importance of managing the records. So there's no directive here. It's just to use not Brenda's favorite phrase, a best practices approach as a reminder. And of course, MMA and counties can take it or leave it, but it's more like a reminder of the mission.
I think that that's a very useful idea. That it's really the overall, as Eric said, before, the overall awareness so that people pay attention to it. And how that is stimulated, I don't know, but I think the idea of, and I don't think we can require it, but at least making it a recommendation that there be an annual reminder. Perhaps the state archives could put that as part of the policies, so that, especially, somebody who's been doing it for years and years, maybe it's in their cells and maybe it's not, so having an annual reminder, I think, is probably a very useful thing. And particularly when it stresses what's the point of this? Because, as we heard before, people are busy, and one more thing, they don't want one more thing unless there's a real reason for doing one more thing. And so whatever we can do to encourage that, I think, is useful.
Okay, so do we have a consensus around this? Yeah. Okay, we'll have to come up with some language, and I do think we should make sure that these entities are aware of the training division, because that seems like a ready resource, and especially if it's already being well used, that could be just a matter of practice too, getting people used to reaching out. So the question on texts, and I know just don't do it is easy, but people are going to do it and they are doing it. Once again, do we let the archive do its work and come up with state recommendations and then see the counties and municipalities slot in behind? Kate, you said you're in the process, right? And it'll be a couple of years to get there.
I think so. We'll have the state general schedules done this winter, but then we get to tackle local government. So yeah, it'll probably take at least another year.
So is knowing that enough, or do we have a greater sense of urgency that we should do something more as a subcommittee?
I really don't think there is much more we can do in a concrete way. We could certainly wave a flag and say, this is important, and everybody says, oh yeah, it is, and that's pretty much the end of it if there's not a way to make particular recommendations. And so, yeah, I off the top of my head, I don't see anything else that we as a committee could do right now.
Linda?
How about we just put it in with the suggestion for the annual reminder that the archives are working on a schedule for the state, and then that will trickle down or passed along to the towns, municipalities. Just as more awareness, I guess, is what I'm suggesting.
That resources are on the horizon kind of thing.
But everybody is in the same boat. We're all in this together, and let's all proceed in good fashion.
Eric?
So shared at the last meeting, and in the, it's on the website, I guess, was the policy and the language that comes out of the federal government from 2014 that was put into the U.S. Code, and then the National Archives and Records Administration picked it up and then issued NARA guidance in 2015. And there's a specific paragraph that says that if you're using personal email or other messaging systems, to Brenda's point, you need to, somehow get it into a .gov system. And so they have a paragraph that says, thou shalt do this. And so I guess my specific recommendation would be that as a committee, the Right to Know Advisory Committee, it's important to us that these things be captured, that we would recommend over to our friends at the state archives that they consider engrossing such language into their guidance, just basically, plagiarize from the NARA guidance and do likewise for the state. And then I think that would go a long way to say in principle, because it talks about principle and then the mechanics. In principle, you're conducting government business, and the mechanics are that you need to copy or transfer that into a government system, government email system or government document management system, so that it's discoverable. And I think that one paragraph would be easy enough to adopt. So I guess that would be my recommendation, or even a motion to use that NARA guidance language that was in the meeting notes from last week, and have the state archives consider that of how to take that idea and promulgate it out.
Is that a motion, Eric?
Sure is.
Okay. Is there a second? Can't tell, Kevin, if that's a second or you have a question.
Yeah, I was in agreement with Eric on this, where I think it's an educational issue. I mean, the reason why we have people tell people not to text is because they can't be retained effectively, or they need extra steps to be retained. So it's something to educate whoever on this issue. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that is an issue for Kate, or if that's an issue for wherever the records training comes in, but I think it's one of the two. So, to the extent, I guess I'm not clear what exactly the result would be of Eric's motion, but I think in principle, I'm in agreement and would second it. I think.
Okay. Kate, this idea that the archives would recommend that if somebody were, let's just say a small town, they have to use a personal email to then make sure they copy to a government platform. Is that doable as an instruction from the archive?
That's definitely doable. I'm trying to figure out, again, the mechanism for doing that. Maybe that's part of a preservation policy message. I think we would figure it out, but yes, I do think that's doable. And probably very helpful for them. I will add, most of the town clerks that I've spoken with are really good about their records. They're very knowledgeable, very concerned, very eager to do the right thing. And it's much more about educating the people around them, the various committees and all of that, and getting them on board, because they're not working with this type of record every day as opposed to the town clerk. So it may be a message out to towns that can then be distributed further within their network as well.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to recommend to the archives that they make sure that personal emails copy over to government platforms or document management systems so that it's discoverable. Is there any discussion on that? Eric.
So personal emails, but also messaging systems and phone text messages. So I guess it would be those three things, anything from their personal account, or it could be their government phone, but the challenges of capturing the text messages or whatever these new messaging systems are that aren't in the .gov system, all those three categories of things, personal as well as government issued phones and messaging apps. I guess it would be those three things. Those are the things that are challenging to make sure they're captured and discoverable. If they're just transitory things, that's one thing. But if they're discussing or conducting substantive government business, that's the people's business and needs to be discoverable. So I would just, what you said, but just add messaging systems and text messages.
Text messaging, okay. Brenda?
I just wanted to point out the use of the term discoverable is not necessarily a term that we use in FOA. We say access to records. And I usually, when I hear discoverable, I think about the civil rules of procedure.
You're right.
So I don't want to confuse those two things.
So that into a management system so that it's accessible is what we were looking.
Yeah, and I don't know if Kate has a different term, but at least from in the FOA world, it's accessible.
Same with records management. Accessible is a better term, and retained.
Okay, so we have a motion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do work both worlds, so I do litigation support a lot. So, but yes, I would agree if we want to keep it in that context.
Okay. All right, is there any further discussion? All right, all in favor of Eric's motion with the 2 additional messaging systems and text and we're changing discoverable to accessible? All those in favor? Okay, that looks unanimous.
We have to do a roll call vote.
Do we have to do a roll call? I defer to Anna and Peggy. Rachel?
I have no idea. Do you know, Peggy? I mean,
Right. It probably makes sense to do it just to remove any doubt.
okay.
So do you want me to do a quick roll call?
Sure.
All right. Linda Clancy,
Yes.
Kevin Martin,
Yes.
Judy Meyer,
Yes.
Amy Beveridge,
Yes.
Chris Parr.
Yep.
Eric Stout,
Yes.
Jim Campbell.
Yes.
Okay, I think I got everybody. I know we have lots of other guests on. Did I miss any members?
Okay, we're good. Thank you. All right, next on our agenda is Brenda will talk to us a little bit about FOA training for the legislature. The floor is yours, Brenda.
Thank you. Again, I missed your last meeting, so please redirect me if I'm not quite hitting the crux of your interest. But the legislature as a body receives a FOA training in their pre-legislative conference at the beginning of each session, which means every 2 years. So as the new legislators are gathering together right around the time that they swear their oath, they go into, it may be 3 days, Peggy knows better than me, but it's pretty intense. And they have trainings all day long. And FOA, the Attorney General's office puts on an ethics training, and then usually the FOA training follows that. And I've done it every other year for quite a while. And the AG joins me in those presentations. So the limitation is that they give us an hour, and usually they are talking so much that we end up with half an hour to 45 minutes at the most when we finally get them to stop talking. So it's not a lot of time, and it's a full FOA training. And by statute, that has to include several components. So we have to pack in a lot of material in a short amount of time. And as I said earlier, every training I do has some reference, some component of records management. So I always will talk about that. And I just am a broken record on just don't text, just don't do it. So I'm sure they hear that from me. But this is not records management. It's not an electronic records. It's not an in-depth, practical FOA training. It's an overview of the entire law that to meet the statutory requirements for their annual FOA, their newly sworn FOA training. Now, as part of the pre-legislative conference, they do also have a training with the IT director for the legislature. And I usually coordinate with the IT director to see what they're going to be talking about, what their big concerns are, to see, and I usually follow that IT training so I can emphasize any points that they feel need extra emphasis. So I do collaborate with them to make sure that we're on the same page. And in that training, my understanding is there, for instance, they're learning how to set up their legislative email account. They're hearing things about retention of records. They're getting the practical aspect of all their communications as legislators. So there's a collaboration there, but it may be that some of what you're hoping the information that they get is actually coming from the legislative IT department. But for instance, I do give them some language for a FOA disclaimer for their official legislature email accounts. And then, of course, point them to the resources that are available. And I do take questions from legislators a lot throughout the year. But the area that I see some of the bigger problems are for the legislators is that once they're elected, they are transitioning from a candidate to now an elected official. And they've got to make that transition. And one of the things the legislature wants them to do is, start using a legislative email account. But I know in the past that there have been some cumbersome elements to that. And then, of course, all of their constituents or in their life as a candidate, they were working with a private email account. That's what everybody knows. And so there is what I consider the problematic area of continuing to use an old personal email account because that's where all your contacts are and that's what everybody knows you by. And that's not on the server, right? And that's not the official account. So that's an area right there. But again, it's not my understanding that the legislature forbids or requires that legislative email be the only one that they use. I could be wrong about that at this point, but I never saw a policy essentially that said you can't use your old email accounts. But again, that would be coming out of the legislative IT or the executive director's office. Again, my consistent message is get it on the server and don't use third-party platforms that are off the server for official business, to keep it simple. Now, is that some of the questions that you were focused on? I'm happy to go on or expand on that.
I think we were just interested in the depth, kind of in the scope of what that training is. But you're right, in a 3-day period when they only get an hour, it's a lot of information to be thrown at them.
Right, and I really do think that the more practical aspects of how they're going to be communicating as legislators comes from their own IT department and from the executive director's office.
Mm-hmm.
They get the overview of FOA, but that's not the practical aspect of setting up a legislative email account or, how do you search or, how do you manage those records or any of that.
So Brenda, do you have any recommendations on whether that's enough? Should there be more?
I think the unknown, at least for me, is how much support is available to the legislators from their own IT department, because there's really a lot that's got to happen there. And I just don't know if that's robust and they're really working with them, a lot's going to be taken care of at that point. In terms of understanding the requirements of FOA, I personally don't think that our statutory training is enough. it's a minimum, it's a basement, like Jim said, but you can always benefit from more. But a lot of times that's individual. I'll get an individual call or an email about a question about something. And that's where, you do a lot of work in that way, trying to help people understand, because they don't realize until they have a problem, how do I deal with this? So I don't know how robust that support is on their IT side. But I would think that, if it's not robust, it would be an excellent place to put more resources.
Peggy?
I was just going to say that I think they have pretty good support. They don't have a whole lot of people to provide support to legislators, but they are always fielding questions from legislators. And one of the things that the Legislative Information Technology Office says is, we will help you if somebody requests information. They make a FOA request of your email, but only the legislative email. So that's, if you're doing business in your legislative account, those are public. I mean, in your private account, those are public records, but LIT is not going to help them sort that out. They're going to have to work on that on their own. So that's kind of the encouragement to keep all their work emails in their legislative email. And I think the practice that most of the committee analysts have developed is to, when a legislator says, I don't check my legislative email, please send it to my personal email. We send it to both, so they know that they can always go to LIT and get the support they need to search them out, as opposed to us just communicating to them with their personal email. And I'm wondering, we do a little tiny bit of orientation in committees when we start a 2-year legislative session. And maybe we should be tapping into Brenda and maybe even Kate to come to the committees and, answer questions at the very least. Yeah, Kate's excited about this.
I'd be happy to do that too.
Right. I hadn't really thought about that. Our orientations are usually really fast in committee, but this might be a really worthwhile thing for the committees to start doing on a regular basis. At the beginning of that, it kind of supplements the training they get in the pre-legislative conference.
It might seem more real too at the committee level, right? Because the work is about to be done. And that's something, Kate and Brenda, you would be willing to do? Okay.
I sure would. Mhm.
Okay. Do we want to make that recommendation coming out of this subcommittee? See a thumbs up from Amy. Linda. Eric. Jim, do you have a question? Or is that just is it a thumbs up?
That's my approach to a thumbs up.
Okay, and Chris, same to you.
I do have a question. So is this just with respect to emails or other messaging device?
I think this would be a broader, just mission FOA approach at the subcommittee level, is my understanding. And it might be a more valuable hour than the full legislature with smaller groups. All right, well, that sounds like consensus then. All righty. Thank you, Brenda, very much. And last on our agenda is list management tools, MailChimp and the like. And I'm trying to remember what the origins of this are, but I think it morphs also from candidates using MailChimp to get out the vote and then continuing to using those platforms once they're elected. So would this already fall under our previous motion as a messaging system? Or do we want to look at this separately? I am not MailChimp versed, so I would need some help.
It is a messaging system. There are several others as well, but The problem is that all the sort of metadata, at least, lives on the MailChimp system. It doesn't live, and you don't have any way of switching it over en masse to a state system. So, and if you've got 50 or 100 or 200 or 500 people on that MailChimp list, that becomes a real problem in terms, even if you wanted to follow the rules. So I think that's part of what the difficulty, and I wasn't at the meeting, but I imagine that's part of what the issue is.
Very hard to wrap my head around what we might even be able to try to do with this. I mean, if it's a database of contacts that an elected official built during a campaign, they're not yet public records, right? Because they're not yet an elected official. But then when they become elected official, are they retroactively public? This sounds like a big topic. Eric?
I just want to put out there that I did some research on that, and I provided the links, and I think it was Peggy that sent them out to the MailChimp Maine website, and all their legal statements, and the user agreement and everything. There was like 7 or 9 links of a page each. So there, if we want to look into it, that was sent out last time. I think Peggy sent that out on our behalf. But other than that, I haven't really looked at it. But it is an interesting question when people transition from their, in this case, their candidate life to their public servant life. And I think it gets down to, as part of the training that we just talked about, orientation, that they need to, have that really grounded in their brain, that they are stewards of the public trust now, and that their business is the public's business. I think most people kind of agree to that, but some may still want to kind of, fly under the radar, or be, kind of resist that full transparency. And not just legislators, but I mean state officials too. I've known of cases where, commissioners, want to continue to use their private computer or their private email versus their .gov email. And so it's just a matter of teaching them correct principles and finding ways to hold them accountable.
So Eric, are you suggesting this could be covered in a more intensive training, maybe part of the subcommittee work?
Well, I think, Brenda has said this other times where, not today necessarily, but it really starts with law, and then rules, and then policy, and then procedures, and training, and accountability. So you got this hierarchy, these levels where one supports the other. So I think we start with, what could be baked into for example, the archives records management law, which is at the statute level, and then the rules that come out of the Chapter 1 rules, for example, that flow from the state archives rules, and then the records retention policies that flow from that, and then the procedures and the mechanics and the training that flow from that, and then the accountability that flows from that, like with annual reminders where they have to, acknowledge the policies and they're following the practices. So just making the point that it starts with that hierarchy of those 5 or 6 levels, of which awareness and training is one of the levels that flows down from law, policy, procedures, and training. and accountability.
Mhm. Linda?
I'm just curious if this is a conversation about terminology as well, and not just elected officials, but volunteers on committees or in school committees. And maybe this is a question for Jim, but when we talk about messaging, we have, I mean, the constant contact has been in existence for quite a while. And then we have the Facebook private groups, and now we have MailChimp, and they're all basically private conversations with a select group of people. So do we say that in whatever messaging we put out at this point in history? We cite those different platforms just to make sure the message gets across.
There's a there's another issue here that we're not going to solve it today, but all of those other outside services have their own privacy policies, and they have their own, rules and their own policies that you agree to when you sign on to use them. And so that, I think, can be another issue. I don't think we need to deal with it, but I think that, in trying to say, for example, what I would say is once you have been a candidate and now you are a legislator, about the second thing you ought to do is send a message out to your MailChimp or Constant Contact or whatever it is, and say, thanks to you, I've been elected and I'm here to represent you. And from now on, this is how you contact me. And I will not be able to use this other address anymore. That is something that I think is concrete and that we could recommend. I personally think it ought to be a rule, but in any event, we could certainly recommend it and provide a specific way to do that, with the legislator explaining, now that I am a public servant, anything that I do falls under the FOA law, and I want to respect that, and I love the spirit as well as blah blah blah. So those are absent doing something like that. I don't think there's a prayer of ever being able to capture that stuff. I might be wrong. I have been before. I think it was maybe 1983, but I really don't think that there's anything else we can do. But if the legislature were to make it a policy, for example, that once someone was elected, that they should no longer use those kinds of private messaging services, I think that would be a great thing, and I would be happy to recommend that. There's one other thing that we haven't mentioned, and I don't know if we want to mention it right now, but at some point we probably do want to mention it, and that is all of the encoded apps like WhatsApp and Signal and so on and so forth. Can we have a way to say, legislators and state agencies can't use these? Brenda said, don't text. I would say, if it's government business, don't Signal, don't WhatsApp either, because it's even a bigger problem than text. So, but that might be for another day. But for right now, to use large systems like Constant Contact or MailChimp or whatever, I I would suggest that we suggest that almost immediately upon election, that legislators tell all the people on their lists that they're switching over and they should be contacted, through their legislative mailbox.
Brenda.
I think the complicating wrinkle is that the definition of public record has to do with content, not necessarily just your status as an elected official. So it has to concern the transaction of government business. So if it doesn't concern the transaction of government business, even though you're a public official, it's not a FOA record. And we do have this distinction for elected officials of the kind of work they do as a candidate or their party business. So they may be active in their party, and they may be campaigning for other candidates, or they may be doing other things that are purely political that are not necessarily the transaction of government business. And that's not, so to tell them that they can't use the communication methods that they established outside of this role, once they go into this role, I'm not sure it recognizes the fact that they may still communicate about party business, for instance, that may or may not be a public record. And so I'm not sure that you're going to see a lot of buy-in to a person who's a politician, essentially telling them that they can't use the established methods of being a politician that got them into the position that they're in. Now, if it's government business and it meets the definition of public record, absolutely, I totally agree. And I send that message right out there. No public business on private accounts, on third-party platforms, on anything, just don't do it. But I don't know that we can say, and you can never, and you have to disable all of those. You have to disable your Facebook and your private email and all, because they can do party business and that's not necessarily public. So I wanted to make that distinction, that little complicating distinction. And then with the MailChimp question came to me, and I don't have all the facts on this. I have some assertions and a little bit of my own research, but I think the real concerning problem is that the assertion is that MailChimp allowed the elected official to use their .gov address on this third-party platform. So this wasn't a separate personal email address, Joe candidate at MailChimp. This was Joe, I just got elected to this position, .gov. And so when you got this email, you didn't know it was on you didn't know it was MailChimp. It looked like a .gov address. It was, being used that way. So there was this confusing element that it came through as a .gov address, and then records were produced in response to a FOA, but they didn't include any of the metadata. And that had to do with how the third-party platform terms of service and access to what's there, that you just don't get that. So some records were produced, but the metadata, which was of interest to the requester, was not there. So one suggestion I have is that we talk about email all the time, and I think that, again, we want to be forward facing, because there are lots of things that are already replacing email. And, if there is a consensus to put some sort of statement out there about how officials use their communication platforms, I would suggest the language should be broad enough to include messaging systems, not necessarily name them all, but at least not limit it to email, because or even texting. Because I just think that's changing so fast that it'd be better to be able to say the principle here is the records have to be managed. They have to be managed by the agency, and they need to be on agency servers, regardless of which messaging system it is. So that would be my only suggestion on that.
Okay, thank you. Kate?
So one of the projects that the archives is just about to embark on, as we just kind of kicked it off last week, we are doing a pilot project with a social media vendor who will archive and capture social media accounts. We're testing it out with the Secretary of State Department and a couple of other departments just to see how that actually works, how beneficial it is, how accessible is that, to see if that is some sort of a solution for some of these social media and email distribution services. We want to kind of test it out and play with it and understand it before trying to embark on something for all of state government. But so there may be some technological tools that are available, but I think we need to better understand them because it's all so very new. Part of where this came from is in talking with state agencies, and I guarantee it would be the same for any elected officials, is their desire to meet their constituency where they are and make themselves as accessible as possible. And very often these email distribution services or social media, that's what people are used to. That's how they're approaching and looking to interact. And so a lot of state government is wanting to meet them where they are to be accessible. But what we still need to do is figure out how to best do that in the most responsible way while still capturing those records. We got to test it out though. That's the part we don't know yet.
Okay. Well, we could defer to the archive on this topic as well until they sort it all out. I do agree with Brenda that it would be very hard for us to tell legislators you have to stop using a particular platform. And I almost could see it as a First Amendment issue for them to be constrained by how and where they can communicate with their constituency. So, but the problem is real. In the case where the metadata was lost, was there a solution, Brenda, to that FOA?
I believe that the requester didn't pursue it at that point.
Okay. Well, is our solution then to just broaden our terminology when we're talking about training and messaging systems, and then look to the archive to sort out the details? Does that feel comfortable to everybody? I feel like we've just piled all kinds of stuff on Kate's plate here today.
It's all stuff we're working on anyways, or we want to work on. So this is good.
Good. Linda?
I really appreciate knowing what you all are doing in it. And that's, I think the rest of the state will too. So thank you.
Agreed, for sure. Eric?
So in the language that I offered at the last meeting that's posted on our website, the NARA guidance, it does use the term messaging system. So I would recommend, going back to look at that language to see if, Kate, you might want to just plagiarize that as is, or at least adapt from that. But I think that's well thought through, the NARA guidance from 2015 that was shared on the website from the last meeting of the technology subcommittee. And if you need that, we can resend that to you.
Okay, that is all of our agenda, unless somebody has something else they want to bring up. Means we can adjourn early, get 18 minutes. Eric?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Since the last meeting, I've talked to Linda and she shared some details on how to either forward or copy text messages to an email system. And I've explored some, Googled some websites and explored kind of there's some up there that show the steps for either those scenarios, either to forward or to capture screenshot. And I can take that as a task to share with the technology subcommittee before next time, if that's of interest. I do want to say that when I tried the steps that they gave for forwarding a text message to my state email, it tried to go to my eric.stout@maine.gov, and it diverted and went to my phone as a text message. But when I sent it to my Gmail, it went into my Gmail email. So there's something in the state where I have two phones, I have my personal phone and my state phone. And so when it goes into my state phone, there's something called Intune that syncs my phone to my to the state email, and it has a two-factor authentication and all that. Something in there when I tried the steps that worked with my Gmail from text to Gmail email, it wouldn't work with going into my maine.gov email. It recognized it as a text message and it diverted it to my phone. So anyway, I'm going to do some more experimenting. Where I'm going with this is that I would be looking to say, okay, in principle, you should do this. Here's the 5 steps of how to do it, and have a little, like a user guide. Do this, do these steps. But we want to make sure that it works in all scenarios. But if there's interest, I can take that as a task and see if I can write that up.
Well, it'd be good to know if it works, for sure. Yes. Chris?
Thank you. I was not going to volunteer to filibuster for the rest of the time. I guess my question is, and Eric made a comment that made me realize I hadn't thought about this before. What else do we have to talk about as a subcommittee? Is there going to be another meeting, or have we talked about everything that we were supposed to talk about? That's just my question.
Yeah, I think we've talked about everything we're supposed to talk about, but Anna and Peggy can check me if I'm wrong.
We were going to ask you.
Well, maybe we'll get another assignment on Wednesday when we convene as a full committee, but these were the things that have been on our agenda. So we'll assume no future meeting unless Right to Know gives us another assignment this week. And we'll bring these recommendations forward on Wednesday. All righty. Enjoy your extra quarter of an hour. See everybody later this week.
Thank you, Judy.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks.